Good evening. My name is Selena Joffrey, and I'm the Director of Business and Policy at Asia Society Texas Center. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tonight's program is part of our COVID-19 New Reality series and addresses the topic of the COVID-19 economy and the road to recovery. Nearly a year after the first businesses began to shutter, the impact to the global economy has been felt across numerous industries. Some of the businesses have closed permanently, leading millions of people to lose their jobs, while financial markets have experienced several extreme fluctuations. Out of this global recession, the road to recovery will look different for each economy. What will be the pandemic's impact on the global economy? And what will recovery look like for two of the world's largest economies, China and the US? To address some of these topics, we have a very special guest with us all the way from Hong Kong that I'm extremely honored to introduce. Weijian Shan is chairman and CEO of PAG, a Hong Kong-based private equity firm. He's the author of two books, Money Games and Out of the Gobi, and a regular contributor to the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, and others. Our moderator is Marty Goosen. He's vice chairman of JP Morgan Private Bank. He also serves as the vice chair of the board of directors of Asia Society Texas Center. Before we get started, I would like to share that Asia Society is an educational institution promoting cross-cultural understanding for a more inclusive world. Because we believe in the importance of having access to diverse communities and perspectives, many of Asia Society's programs, like this one, are free. Please consider supporting our work through a tax-deductible gift by texting Asia Society TX to 243-725. We hope you enjoy the program. Marty, over to you.
Thank you, Selena. And it's so great to be back in another Asia Society Texas Center program. We started in early April with the very first COVID series with Dr. Mark Bohm. And I'm honored tonight to introduce a friend and also a luminary in many of the topics we're going to discuss tonight. Shan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you. Great pleasure to be here.
Well, Weijian Shan, I remind everybody, and we call him Shan. That's his family name. It's a real privilege to have you with us. You've had an incredible life story. You can read about it in the you can certainly read about it in the notes of the program. But your life story really started in Beijing, ended up spending many years of your youth in the Gobi Desert. You went on to go to the United States. You got a master's, you got a PhD, you taught at Wharton. And then I first met you, I think in 90 or 91 or something like that, Shan, when you joined JP Morgan, which I think was your first job as a banker. And over the last 30 years, you've continued to build on that skills and that success in the private equity space. Now you've become an author. And we spoke last August, a year ago August, on your book, Out of the Gobi. And I understand you've just released, in fact, I just bought a copy of your most recent book, Money Games, the incredible story of how American deal makers saved an iconic Korean bank. That's Korea First Bank. I know you led that deal, but I want to ask you a question. Why'd you write a book about it?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on this program. I wrote Money Games because I realized that there's no book around to talk about a private equity major transaction from very beginning to the end. And there's a lot of curiosity about private equity. There's a lot of talk about it, but the private equity is very little understood. Today in the United States, private equity firms control more companies than all the publicly listed companies combined. That's how influential private equity is. And yet, there's no book that addresses a process by which private equity makes money. I'm sure many people have read Barbarians at the Gate, talking about KKR's acquisition of RJR Nabisco back in 1988. The book was written in 1989, 1 year after the transaction was closed. And it was a fascinating book. It became bestseller. It was made into HBO TV series. It became very popular. And yet, very few people know that KKR was in that deal for 15 years, at the end of which they lost $750 million out of the $3 billion invested. They borrowed $22 billion, invested $3 billion in equity, and lost $750 million for their investors. So there are a couple of books dealing with the deal-making part of private equity, but mine provides the insider's account of the full story from negotiating the deal, investing in the company, turning around the company, eventually exiting from the investment. And by the way, we made a lot of money out of it. So I thought either for the finance industry or for any person, a lay person, it's a fascinating story, but it also unlocks the mystery of private equity.
Well, you've come a long way from collecting reeds in the Gobi Desert to writing a book on a highly successful private equity deal. So that it also tells kind of a full circle of the success you've had, Shan. Let's get to the topic tonight, which, as you know, is talking about COVID, the impact of COVID, economically, socially. And we really want to get tonight a view from Asia, specifically China, but also I know you're based in Hong Kong. You're in Hong Kong this morning, your time. Thank you again. So I'm going to break this down into four basic themes, and we'll just go where we go. The first one is what was and has been China's experience with COVID-19. Then I want you to just contrast that. We'll talk a little bit about the US's experience with COVID-19. We want to talk about recovery. Now, maybe recovery in China has already happened. In fact, we'll talk about that. Recovery is a long ways away completely, certainly from the disease here in the United States, and I'd love to talk to you about that. And finally, I'd like to ask you for your opinions, because you've seen this from a very international perspective. What are the lessons learned, and how do we come out a better place as a result? So if that's an okay a series of topics, that's where we'll go. By the way, for our audience, Shan and I are going to speak for the next 30, 35 minutes, and we would love to have you put any questions you have into the chat box, and we will get to those questions, I hope, in the last few minutes of our conversation. So please feel free to enter them at any time, and they'll get into me, and I'll be forwarding those on to Shan later on. So China was the first country to suffer at least the early cases of COVID-19. And reportedly, it originated in Wuhan, reportedly in a wet market in Wuhan. Is that correct? Is that your understanding? There have been a lot of different theories about that, Shan. Is that really your understanding of what happened?
And that is correct. I actually did a lot of research in this regard. Steve Roach of Yale University and I wrote an article for Project Syndicate, tracing the beginning of the virus and how this thing unfolded in the early few months of this pandemic.
And there's conspiracy theorists who suggested it was done in a lab. Do you actually think it was originated in a market?
I think a number of prominent scientists, including Dr. Fauci, resoundingly rejected that conspiracy theory. There's just no evidence that is the case.
Okay, so the numbers, according to Johns Hopkins for China, is that the cases basically now stand at approximately 90,000, one side or other of that number, and there have been approximately 4,700 deaths in China. Those are the numbers as you know it, and I will say, as you might suspect, there are theorists in the West that believe that can't possibly be the case, because the new cases are coming in at single digit a day, and most of those are imported, I understand. What is the actual number that you believe? Is that 90,000 number accurate in terms of mainland China?
I think the numbers do sound quite unbelievable, right? If you compare that with the United States, where the number of infections have reached more than 9 million cases, the number of deaths has reached 235,000. So for China, with a death of 4,739 for a population 1.4 billion people in a country where the virus originated, that does sound quite incredible. I don't think that any data, any number from any country are perfectly accurate. It's just the nature of data. Some numbers may not be picked up somewhere, but by and large, I think the picture is correct. We, PAG, as a private equity firm, have many employees in the portfolio companies we own, we control. We have in our portfolio companies in China 49,000 people. And of the 49,000 people, since April of this year, there has been no single case of infection, and certainly no death at all. In the United States, in America, which includes Mexico, we have 54,000 employees in our portfolio companies. And to date, we have 1,600 infections and 39 deaths. In Europe, we have 29,000 employees in our portfolio companies. We have 3 deaths. Elsewhere in Asia, we also have 3 deaths. So our private data match the public data almost perfectly. And that's the picture that you see. So I don't think that any number is perfectly accurate, but in terms of large picture, the numbers that you have cited, I think, are correct.
So you said you did a great deal of research on this. So explain to our audience, how is that possible?
What is possible?
That so few cases in China.
Oh, okay.
What did they do that no place else, virtually no place else, and even Singapore got caught, as you well know. For a while, Singapore was very confident that they had it under control, and then they had it afterwards, so on and so forth. So virtually no country, other than maybe New Zealand, has really been able to ring fence this disease. And New Zealand has 3 or 4 million people. China has, as you said, over 1 billion. How is that possible?
Well, let me probably tell you a story about our own company again. We have a private insight into how they handle this case. We wanted to arrange 3 American engineers to come to China to commission a plant somewhere in the middle of China. And it was extremely difficult to get a visa for these people to come. And when they finally came, well, they had to be tested 72 hours before the flight. One of them simply couldn't board the flight because where he lives in Connecticut, he couldn't get any clinic to give him a result within 72 hours, and therefore he could never get onto a flight. But by rule, they have to get a negative testing result before boarding the flight. Once in China, they couldn't go to the destination directly. It is a designated city, they land, and then they are quarantined. And 3 of them were quarantined in one hotel. They could order food from anywhere with Alipay or WeChat Pay to be brought to their hotel, but they couldn't step out of the hotel. One of them was taken away to another hotel, and for about 30 minutes, we were all wondering what was happening. It turned out he sat on the flight within 4 rows of somebody who was tested positive. So he and all the people on that flight were sent to a different hotel to be quarantined, and they were tested twice a day. After 2 weeks, they were released, sent to their destination, where they were quarantined for another 2 weeks before they were allowed on the factory site. These are the very strict measures that they take to make sure that any case is detected early, quarantined early, traced early, and treated early. Any positive test result would result in the patient hospitalized. In the United States, you have to have symptoms or severe symptoms in order to be hospitalized. But in China, as long as you're positive, you're hospitalized. So in Wuhan, the first case was discovered on December 27th of last year. The Chinese director of CDC called the US director of CDC on December the 31st. Initially, they thought this virus could not be passed, or there was no evidence that the virus could be passed person to person. But by 23rd of January, they decided that it is this contagious. So they locked down the city of Wuhan. Now, the lockdown in China is very different from the lockdown in the United States. Nobody could go in, nobody could come out, except essential personnel with protective gears. So China was locked down for the first quarter of this year when GDP dropped 6.8%. So it was a very severe drop for China. And China reopened only after the cases became zero. And that is in March of this year. And since then, there was some flare up here and there, but very small occurrences, and they were able to control them very effectively. So I think the very severe measures of the lockdown of testing, tracing, quarantine, and treatment did the trick. Just about a month ago, there was one case in Qingdao, and then they tested 10 million people within a few days, just to make sure that it was not spread anywhere. So I think the measures that China took is hard to be replicated in other countries.
Yes. I think there are many social and political issues probably associated with that. And I know some other countries in Asia, of course, Korea and others, did similar sorts of things and did certainly contain it, certainly better than most of the West. So while maybe their cases loads were higher, they have been able to at least keep it under control. But they did, as you suggested, they suffered some economic impact. But the third quarter GDP in China, while slightly below expectations, was up 7.5%, looking for probably a double-digit GDP in the fourth quarter and a full year positive GDP for the full year in China. So the economic situation is not nearly as it was as bad as it was in some of the Western countries.
That is correct, but the numbers are not accurate. The numbers that you cited, the number 7.5% refers to the export growth number in July, year over year. Export went up 7.5% in July over the same period of last year. In August, China's export went up 9.2%, and in September, 9.9% over the same period of last year. But for GDP, China's GDP in the second quarter went up 3.2% over last year. And in the third quarter, 4.9% over last year. Now, the Chinese way, or actually anywhere in the world, the way to count GDP growth or decline somewhat different from the American way. America statistics works in such a way to compare quarter from quarter. For example,
that's what the 7.5 number is. It's quarter over quarter. Fair point.
Right. So in China, is this quarter compared with the quarter of last year, the same quarter last year. So on comparable basis, with the United States, America's GDP probably fell about 9% year over year in the second quarter. And then it came back, but still 4 or 5% below last year in the third quarter. So that's the comparison I think that you can make between China and America. So you're correct that China's economy has recovered actually quite strongly. There's a domestic GDP number. There's also the export number. Both have shown very strong recovery. I don't think the export growth number will sustain itself. The reason is that China is able to export so much because its trading partners' production is so much down. So the demand remains there, so they have to import from countries like China. When other countries like the United States recover their economies, the China's export growth number probably will come down. But suffice it to say, by the end of the year, we expect 2 to 3% annualized growth for China over the same period of last year. Over last year. Yeah.
So what industries in China have done the best and what industries have suffered? Certainly in the United States, for example, the hospitality industry and anything associated with that is off probably 40 to 50% on a year-over-year basis. Is that similar in China? Is there freedom of movement in China today? Can you travel wherever you want to if you're based in China?
Within China, it is completely open and completely free. So you can travel anywhere and there's no restrictions of whatever kind: restaurants, entertainment, movie theaters, hotels. So I think hospitality sector was the worst hit. But China has one advantage that America does have as well, but European countries don't have. China is a big country in terms of the size of the country, geographical size of the country is about the same as the United States. China is 9.3 million square kilometers. I use kilometers, sorry, not miles. And America is 9.6 million square kilometers, so about the same. And therefore, domestic travel is very busy. In Europe, you fly half an hour, you're out of the country. So now the airlines are completely shut down in Europe. But in China, domestic travel has completely resumed to normal. And in America, of course, domestic travel is more or less okay, but the volume has come down quite substantially. I would say the winners coming out of this pandemic in any economy is e-commerce. People have learned to buy things from Amazons of the world. In China, it's Alibaba, Taobao. And we own a business called Tencent Music Entertainment, which is like Spotify of China, except we have 800 million monthly unique active users. So it's the largest in the world by far. And our business is substantially up for this year. I suppose when people don't have anything to do in the lockdown, they listen to music, among other things. But we have a dairy business, the largest in China, whose EBITDA is up 40% this year. I remember a commercial in the US when I lived there, and I repeated it to our children when they were still very young. Milk that does the body good. I think this year the Chinese all of a sudden discovered or thought that milk probably would boost their immune system, and therefore the milk consumption has increased substantially. So our dairy farm business is up quite substantially, 40% EBITDA. Around the world, I think these sectors really severely affected negatively, other than hospitality, is retail. In the United States, as you know, J.Crew, Neiman Marcus, and the like have severely suffered from the pandemic, and many of them went under. And I think that for the retail sector, the damage may be permanent. For hospitality sector, for international travel, it will take a long time to come back. But for some other businesses, other industries, the damage probably will be temporary. And when the economy recovers, and they will be able to bounce back.
What about the rest of Asia, Shan? As we've referred earlier, Selena actually mentioned it, policies around COVID have been national. Sometimes more in the US, they're more local, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But in Asia, there are more national policies, Korea, Singapore, as we discussed, Hong Kong. Where do you see the differences being? As you have businesses all over the region, where are the differences that you see the most, either on the good side or the bad side of the experience? India, of course, is a very famous challenge, right? Their case numbers are rising every day. Their death numbers are rising every day dramatically, and they may someday outstrip the United States. What are your thoughts about the rest of Asia?
The best performer with regard to dealing with the pandemic, other than China, is Taiwan. Taiwan has very few cases, very few deaths, and more or less the island is completely open. So they have dealt with this pandemic very effectively. India in Asia is the worst case. To date, India has more than 8 million cases, and that is probably undercounting, because in India, testing is still very difficult to come by. And they have 124,000 deaths, which may also be an understatement. India took measures which were almost too severe, but not severe enough at the same time, which contributed to the pandemic being out of control at this particular moment. What do I mean by too severe but not severe enough? At the beginning of the pandemic, they, within 3 hours, locked down the entire country. That's very severe for a country of more than 1 billion people. They just decided to lock it down completely. So that's too severe. But at the same time, they locked down all the transportation. So all the migrant workers, the peasants who work in big cities like Mumbai and Delhi, they had to make a living, and there was no living to be made in big cities because everything was shut down. All the factories were shut down as well. So they had to go home to the countryside, to the rural villages. And there was no transportation. So they walked, they hiked, they biked all the way to their home villages, and therefore spreading the virus throughout the country, and got India infected on a very large scale. And that's how things got out of control. So their policy, until very recently, was really abject failure. And now I think they're doing a little better, but the situation is still very bad. Korea, Singapore are doing much better now, as Japan.
Yes, and of course, Singapore had a brief problem with their migrant workers,
Yes.
actually, and in those migrant worker housing facilities, they had outbreaks within those facilities. But in any case, generally speaking, across the general population in Singapore, they handle it very well, as has Hong Kong, where you are, correct?
That's correct. Hong Kong has handled the pandemic very well, but not the economy very well. Hong Kong is in a deep recession. Hong Kong actually went into a recession in the second half of last year when everybody was growing. America was growing, China was growing, rest of Asia was growing. But Hong Kong went into a recession last year. And of course, the recession is much more severe today than last year. So Hong Kong's economy is doing very bad, very poorly.
Yes, I noticed the unemployment rate in Hong Kong reached 5.6%, I think was the number.
Which is considered to be very high for Hong Kong.
I mean, all my years I lived in Hong Kong, I would never remember it ever starting with more than a 2, I don't think. So that is very high for certainly for Hong Kong. Let's turn a little bit, Shan, because I'd like your international view of the U.S. You referred to it earlier, 9.5 million cases, 100,000 a day. Now we just had our second day with 100,000 new cases, so it's clearly not slowing down. 235,000 deaths. And that's from a start of zero on January 22nd, the first, we believe, was an imported case in Washington state, to where we are today, basically 10, 11 months later. Now we're probably in our third wave. We keep talking about waves, when there was going to be a first wave, second wave, third wave. We're probably in our third uptick, whether you want to call it a wave or not. The original one, then it got contained, and then in the summer, then it got contained, and now we seem to be surging again, certainly state by state, different things. We talked earlier about policies around how to control this. I'd love your thoughts, because we are very much locally driven in terms of the way these policies, generally state by state, but then also company by company when you get into various locations. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, of course, I observe America from afar, but I observe it very closely on daily basis, sometimes on hourly basis, because we're greatly concerned about the situation in the United States, which affects the entire world. This is not first time that America is going through a pandemic. We all talk about the Spanish flu of 1918. I think very few people know that the Spanish flu actually originated in the United States, in Kansas City, where troops were gathered before they were sent to Europe to fight in the First World War. That's where the outbreak first occurred. And then when the troops got to Europe, they infected the European Allied forces, and then the virus jumped across the battle line to affect the Germans and all that. But the warring states were exercising military censorship during the wartime, and therefore the infections were not so much reported among the warring states. And Spain was a neutral country where there was no censorship, and they reported the disease freely, and therefore they got this name, Spanish flu, associated with the country of Spain. And if you look at even the documentaries, how America dealt with the 1918 Spanish flu, in fact, even President Woodrow Wilson was infected as well. He became very sick. If you look at the documentaries, you find that Americans took a very simple measure, and that was to wear masks. You look at the old documentaries in San Francisco, in New York, everybody was wearing a mask. And the second major pandemic, as labeled by the WHO in more recent history or memory, was 2009. If you remember, H1N1. And just about 10 years ago, when everybody was storing up Tamiflu, and there was a pandemic, and within that year, 2009, about 25,000 Americans died just within 8 months. And the disease originated from pig farms in the Midwest. And at the time, PPE, personal protection equipment, all the medical equipment, including Tamiflu, were very adequate. So worldwide, H1N1 killed about 500,000 people. Less than that, actually less than 500,000 people. Because Tamiflu, quarantine of children, because that disease affected children more than the older people, and all the measures issued by CDC in the United States that all the other countries followed. So for this pandemic, surprisingly, America was very ill prepared. And from afar, it seems that America is still not very well prepared. And wearing a mask now has become a political issue. If you come to Hong Kong, where there are 0 cases, everybody wears a mask, and nobody thinks twice about wearing masks. just for their own protection of other people. So it seems that America is handling this pandemic very different from how it did it in the past pandemics. And it is somewhat puzzling to observers from very far away, because I think you should open the economy, you should go back to work, but a simple measure of wearing mask will go a long way to protect people, as Fauci and some other people have suggested. But it seems a lot of people simply don't want to do that.
Well, you remember also, Shan, if I may interrupt, there were commentators from the WHO and the CDC and others early on in this that said masks provided no benefit. Even Dr. Fauci said that early on. So it's not been a generally accepted rule that in fact masks were not. It has become not just a political issue, it's become a ridiculous social issue where people are beating each other up on airplanes, and we're having to toss people off airplanes where they won't wear a mask. So
that's not correct, Marty. I will have to contradict you in this regard. I read whatever Fauci says and whatever WHO says very carefully. At the time when the pandemic first broke out, there was a severe shortage of masks. Hospitals, doctors, nurses didn't have enough PPEs. And therefore, if everybody tried to wear masks, then hospitals would be deprived of the protective gears for the frontline workers. That was when he suggested that people shouldn't wear masks and the priority should be given to hospitals. But now there's abundant supply of masks.
No, certainly today. I mean, there's no question today that, and having lived in Asia as long as I did, I certainly understand the value of masks and the fact that it's a routine thing. Even when there is no pandemic in Asia, people are wearing masks. Should they feel ill or anything, they'll just naturally put a mask on in the morning and keep it on all day long. Let's talk a little bit about the government reaction in the U.S. The U.S. Government moved very fast, faster than they did in the global financial crisis, to throw massive fiscal resources as well as massive monetary resources in the trillions in both cases. The numbers are so large that any economic student would, in my years, wouldn't even understand it possible. But did the Chinese use fiscal and monetary measures as well to keep the economy strong, or did they just isolate it such that the rest of the economy around the rest of the country outside of Hubei province did fine without any stimulus?
Many people, including myself in China, suggested that China should adopt a bigger stimulus package than they did. In fact, they were very timid. The fiscal stimulus package was extremely small. I suggested in some publications that government should issue consumption coupons to individuals, which of course would help individuals, but would also help bringing up the demand for suppliers. And altogether, by my count, all the provinces and cities in China issued consumer coupons totaling about $20 billion, which is nothing for a country of $15 trillion GDP. So that's the extent that they did it. On the monetary side, they're also very timid. Today, interest rate in the United States is practically zero. 10-year treasury is probably half percentage point in interest rate. But in China, interest rate is about 3 to 4% for government bonds. So there's a big gap in the interest rates. So monetary side, they have not loosened much at all. I think their hands are more tight than in the United States, because China has spent the past 5 years trying to deleverage the economy. So if they all of a sudden leverage up very quickly, they basically wipe out all the efforts that they made in the past 5 years. And then fortunately, the lockdown was lifted at the end of February and early March, so that everybody was able to go back to work. So stimulus is not as necessary in China as in the United States and European countries.
Yeah. So one of the things, for example, we're worried here is about the people that own bars or restaurants or small hotels or things like that. Of course, our situation has lasted much, much longer. But for example, for a restaurant owner in Wuhan, where the whole city basically shut down, did they receive any support from the government, or did they just have to suffer through that period with no demand?
Unfortunately not. I think the government has not done enough to help the small businesses. We own a restaurant chain based in Singapore, but they have few restaurants in Shanghai, and they had to shut down those restaurants during the lockdown, and they have not reopened them. So there's no help from the government in that regard. The helps come from us. We have decided to, everybody chipped in, of course. Workers take pay cut, and we supported the company, but there's only so much that you can do. So the support for small businesses has been very lacking in China. But the Chinese small business bounce back very quickly. So now they have reopened some restaurants. We are looking at a franchise which offers tea as opposed to coffee, and they locate themselves next to Starbucks in China. And Starbucks is doing great business in China, and they're opening like a store almost every day in China today. So, some businesses are coming back, and small businesses, unfortunately, were very much hurt by the lockdown.
Yes, I understand. Before we start taking questions, I want to get on to one final topic, and it basically relates to recovery. And I think the most important thing on everyone's mind now, certainly in this part of the world where the pandemic rages on, it's probably less of an issue in China, and that's the issue of vaccines. We're all waiting for that first vaccine. AstraZeneca today announced that they will have finished their test by the end of the year, and if they bear to be positive, then they could be actually distributing vaccines as early as January. That's the first positive, I think, timeline that we've heard. But there are, as you well know, there are companies in China who are pursuing vaccine strategies. There are companies in Europe and certainly in the United States under Project Warp Speed. What is the importance of a vaccine going to be in China specifically?
I think it's very important because I live in Hong Kong, which is part of China, is across the border from the mainland, but I can't travel to China. If I go there, I will have to be quarantined for 2 weeks. Coming back, I have to be quarantined for 2 weeks. They may open up in December, but right now that's the situation. Without the vaccine, you will still face this kind of restrictions. Of course, international travel is practically impossible, right? So I think it's important for vaccines to be introduced. In China, there were 4 vaccines at stage 3 or phase 3 clinical trials. So hopefully by the end of the year, they will all be completed, or at least some of them will be completed. But one vaccine has been administered to essential workers and the military after completing the second phase of trials. Once they determined that it is safe, they started to vaccinate frontline workers or essential workers. But that's still not commercially approved. And I think the timing in China is probably similar to AstraZeneca has just announced.
Would you, Shan, take that vaccine after only phase 2?
No, not for me. First, I'm not an essential worker. If I stay home, it's okay. But
would you
I'm pretty good at
take a vaccine? Would you voluntarily take? I mean, that would be a problem in the U.S., as you well know. I mean, we have a lot of no vacciners in the U.S. to begin with, and there's still now, because it's become so politicized, there are a lot of people that won't take a vaccine even if it makes it through phase 3. And
in China, it's the same. In China, it's the same. But I think people probably are more receptive taking vaccine in China than in the United States. But nobody can force anybody to take vaccine. But there's one way to force it. If a shop, for example, says without certificate that you have been vaccinated, then they don't allow you to go into the shop, then that makes your life quite inconvenient. For example, everybody in China now has a QR code on their iPhone. Wherever they go, the QR code has to be green. If it's not green, then they are not allowed into certain zones. And in Beijing, a few months ago, when there was a flare up within a building, a small community or compound, then that entire area became red. And if you inadvertently drive through that area, all of a sudden your QR code becomes red. Then nobody will allow you to go into their homes or public places. So there are certain ways that make your life very inconvenient if somehow you don't have a certificate that you're completely immune.
Yes, and as you well know, you've lived long enough in the U.S. to know that that would not be a system that would be...
That would be very difficult for the United States. But I described in my book, Out of the Gobi, when I was a quack doctor or barefoot doctor in the Gobi, we administered vaccine for basically plague, right, for this pandemic. And some people refused to take it. Other people took overdose of it at the time. There was not a plague. There was not a pandemic, but it was just for precaution that people were asked to take this vaccine. But some people do it, some people don't do it.
So we do have a number of questions. Before I do that, I have to ask this, and a couple of questions refer to this, Shan. This may be the longest week of the whole pandemic because we had an election on Tuesday, and it's exactly now 48 hours after. We don't have a result. We may not have a result. We don't know when. And the presidential race, we still have some questions about the senatorial race. We may not get an answer to the Senate until January when Georgia has its two runoffs. So, we're in a state of almost political limbo here. Now, this will end for the president relatively soon. Do you think that the political situation in the U.S., and again, you're an outside observer, but you've lived in the U.S., you know the U.S. extremely well. What do you think the impact of our political situation has been, not just on the economy, but also on the virus?
I wish the result had been out, but of course it is not out. My thinking is, if President Trump wins, then it will be more of the same. You wouldn't expect him to change his policies or his behavior. If Biden wins, I would expect some changes, not only for domestic policies, as he had already stated quite clearly during the campaign, but also foreign policies.
And I have to ask the inevitable question, do you think that will be well accepted in China?
I would think so, not only in China, but in the rest of the world as well. Because in the past 4 years, again, from outside of America, American foreign policy is very much unilateralism. What is good for America and how you deal with different countries, either they're allies in Europe or Canada, or a country which is considered as adversary, that is China. And without much regard to international institutions, such as WTO, such as IMF, the World Bank, such as the Paris Climate Accord, such as TTP, the trade deal in Asia that America initiated. All this world order was initiated and established by the United States. Now, all these international institutions and agreements were initiated by the United States and established by the United States. I think people have become used to playing by the rules of the world order established by the United States until just about 4 years ago, when, of course, international institutions have been very much ignored. America pulled out of Paris Climate Accord, pulled out of TPP, pulled out of Iran nuclear deal, and basically paralyzed the appeal process in WTO, pulled out of WHO, and ignored IMF, underfunded the United Nations. So I think the rest of the world is rather puzzled by this change, major change, from the point of view of other countries in Americans' foreign policy. Americans may not feel this as keenly as foreign countries because Americans tend to look at domestic affairs. And I would expect Biden to be much more respectful as all previous American presidents of international institutions. I think that's where the difference will be.
So we have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that have come in from the audience, Shan. And there are some interesting ones here. I think you've answered one about the presidency, and I'm going to let those two questions. Tabish asked an interesting question. With the economy the way it is now, and I'm not sure this is a question related to the US or maybe globally, is this a bad time or a good time to try to start a new business? You're in the business of businesses. What do you think about an appropriate moment? Is this an appropriate moment to start new businesses?
This is probably as good a time as it gets to start a new business. And I'll tell you why. To start up a business, of course, you need capital. You have a good idea. You need to fund that good idea. And this is a time of unprecedented liquidity in the world market. As some people may know, that a Chinese company by name of Ant Financial was trying to go public. Actually, the trading was supposed to start yesterday, on Thursday, here in Hong Kong. They priced the issue on Friday last week, and the total size of fundraising was $37 billion, which would give the company a market cap of $320 billion, larger than JP Morgan, which is a 150-year-old global institution, and HSBC, which is also a 150-year-old global institution combined. So for this large IPO, I learned that the allocation to American investors was only 20%, which totally shocked me because historically, American capital would represent about 50% of an IPO. So I asked the company, why so little allocation? Is it because American capital, American investors are less interested than investors from elsewhere in this particular IPO? Oh, they said, no, it's not the case at all. In fact, the interest expressed by American investors would be able to take the whole allocation of this IPO of 30-some-odd billion dollars. But there's so much demand from the Middle Easterns, from the Europeans, and from other Asian countries that we could only allocate 20% to American investors. That gives you an indication to what extent there's a glut of capital in the world. And this is very good for venture capital, startup companies trying to raise capital from venture capital firms.
Yes, and I can double that comment. So one of the ways to look at this for you mentioned it earlier. Actually, the 10-year Treasury. Let's use the number 75 basis points. If you assume that inflation in the United States is, let's use the number 1.5%, that means the real return or after inflation return on a 10-year U.S. Treasury note is negative 75 basis points, which makes no sense at all, and is not happened before. Until you get into this sort of an environment. And that means that if you are starting a new business and you need capital is cheaper than it's ever been. Yes. If you went to a bank to borrow money, it's never been this cheap. And the bank would rather lend it to you than lend it to the U.S. government. You're going to get a higher return.
Right, but banks may consider the risk of starting a company too high, but there is a glut of capital in the world, but there's a dearth of good investment opportunities. So if you have a very good idea, I think this is as good a time to start a company as ever.
So John Lagori asks, I think, quite a provocative question. Is there any validity that President Trump, in President Trump blaming China for the international virus spread and asking China to pay all the financial losses?
Well, first of all, let me ask the second part of this question. I don't think there's a viable way. And President Trump has also said in his campaign that China has already paid. Then so be it, because he has collected tariffs, most of which, of course, as we know, are paid by American consumers. With regard to the first question, I don't think so at all. There was one paper written by a historian, a professor at Hoover Institute, which claims that after China locked down on January the 23rd of Wuhan city, it allowed international flights to continue. And in his paper, he showed flight schedules. And then another Harvard professor came out to say, that's totally wrong. That schedule was the schedule printed some long time ago. But as of that day, flight data, we know that there's a lot of data by private collectors. Flight data show that no flight came out of Wuhan after 23rd. So to say that China deliberately spread the virus across the world is just pure nonsense, because you can't do that without infecting your people first.
One of the things that certainly we've had to deal with in the US, and I don't know how much they had to deal with it in China, is work from home. Yes. And also study from home. So we're in a world of what one of our questions talks about digital education. I think this is what he's referring to. And work from home, we have JP Morgan Chase, who I work for, is largely work from home in most places in the United States, and lots of now in Europe. We just locked down our offices in London, for example, and everybody has to work from home in London. This has been back and forth, unfortunately. And our systems and everything that we have within our firm allows that to happen. Children studying from home is a completely different experience. Whether or not they have the systems to do so effectively is one question, with all the things going on at home. Do you have a view on digital education, or for that matter, digital communication, and what the future of that looks like in a post-pandemic world?
I think digital education, taking classes from home, is a very good tool, can supplement the education process of children, but it cannot take over person-to-person contact. When I was a professor at Wharton School, I tell my students that whether you get an MBA from Wharton or Harvard or Stanford or University of San Francisco, the content and the quality of teaching are probably about the same. So what difference you really want to get from a school like Wharton is, number one, to get labeled. If you have a brand name school, that label is very important in your job searching. And the second is to network, right? That network itself is a valuable resource which will help you throughout your career, for the rest of your career. The people you know would help you. If you don't go to school, if you don't interact with other kids, then you won't be able to build that network, and you won't be able to learn the social skills. So I think tools like Zoom, which allow us to have this conference or this program without being in a physical location, is great. But I think it can only be a tool, but it can't really replace person-to-person teaching.
I'm going to ask one last question, running over just a second. Shan, what do you think that 1, 2, or 3 lessons that you hope global politicians, global policymakers, global educators, whatever, take away from this global experience? Typically when you have a hurricane, it's very localized. When you have a typhoon in Asia, it's localized. When you have a recession, quite often it's localized. But this has been a global event by any standard, and a catastrophic one in many places. Are there lessons that we could learn from this? 2 or 3 lessons that you think about and you talk about?
I think it's probably too early to talk about lessons, but let me just change subject a little bit to show that lessons are very important. You see, in my second book, that is Money Games, I talked about 97, 98 Asian financial crisis, during which many banks failed. In Korea alone, 150 banks failed. In Japan, Southeast Asia, so many banks failed. And we went in and bought a major bank, the largest bank, or what used to be the largest bank in Korea, made a lot of money out of it. 10 years later, in 2008, the global financial crisis broke out in the United States with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, AIG, and all that, as we all remember. During that time, so many American banks failed, so many European banks failed, but none of the Asian banks failed, even though it was supposed to be a global financial crisis. The reason was that Asian banks learned a big lesson from the 97 Asian financial crisis. They all restructured, they all recapitalized, they all improved their risk management systems. So when 2008 came, they all were healthy and resilient. Now, forward another 10 years from 2008 to today, we are in the worst recession since after the war. But what about the banks? The banks are doing very well. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan are reporting record earnings, and they are not in trouble at all, far from it. Now, if you think about it, if it were not for 2008, which forced them to recapitalize themselves, to improve their risk management system, to get rid of their bad loans, for the regulators to tighten the regulation, American banks will not be in such a good shape today. Imagine the pandemic happened in 2008, how the American economy will be totally devastated with the burst of housing bubble, the collapse of the banking system. Then on top of that, you have pandemic. It will be disastrous. So because of the lessons learned in 2008, banks in America are very healthy, very resilient, are doing very well. So there goes your lesson. You learn from every crisis to do much better, and next time around, you would do better.
Well, thank you. That's a great reminder to everybody. And hopefully we have a global mindset and a local mindset to be able to take that type of lesson and apply it to the various challenges we faced over the last year. And by the way, we're not out of it yet, as we well know, which is probably why it's too early to, as you suggested, too early to actually put together lessons now. We still have to deal with this, certainly in the Western world and other parts of the globe. Shan, we can't thank you enough for your participation tonight from Hong Kong. We know you have the rest of your day ahead of you, so I hope that's a good one for you. You've been very generous with your time, both when you visited us last August and tonight. Once again, I know you're a great supporter of the Asia Society. You've done programs for us in Hong Kong many times, New York, recently for our West Coast centers, and now for us here in Houston. Thank you so much. We truly enjoyed your feedback and your thoughts. I want to remind our audience, who I want to thank again for joining us, that we are a not-for-profit organization. We provide what we believe to be high-quality educational programs, cultural programs, arts programs, and business and policy programs. And we would love to have your support, not just in participating in these shows, perhaps your financial support. If you enjoyed tonight's program, as Selena said, please text Asia Society TX to the number 243725 and contribute whatever you can. In the meantime, we thank you so much again for joining us, and please check the Asia Society Texas Center website for many of our upcoming programs. Have a great evening, and thank you once again.
Thank you.